On behalf of the Louisa Alcott Society, I want to welcome you to the virtual Alcott sessions for the 2021 American Literature Conference. My name is Mark Gallagher, and I will be your host for the first of the afternoon's two sessions, Alcott and Adaptation. Our second session on teaching Alcott will begin at 3:40 p.m. Eastern, and it will take place at the Zoom link being shared on the screen and in the chat right now. Well, we have a splendid panel assembled for you today. 4 Alcott scholars who are ready to share their insights into some of the many film adaptations of Alcott's works, including the most recent film adaptation of Little Women, directed and written with an adapted screenplay by Greta Gerwig. Just share my screen here. Okay, great. This is her on the set. I think you should see it. Oh, okay. Well, anyways. Oh, there it is. This is Greta Gerwig on the set at the Concord School of Philosophy at Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts, filming a scene with Florence Pugh and my daughter, Catherine, who is, she's in the lower left-hand, she should be in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. She's not really paying attention to what's going on. We anticipate many speakers today with some great insights, and we also anticipate many questions for you as well. Stop share. Okay, well, why don't we get on with it? Our first speaker for today is Amanda Adams. Amanda is associate professor at Muskingum University in Ohio. She works on 19th century American and British literature, focusing on transatlantic culture as well as gender. She is the author of a book on the 19th century transatlantic lecture tour, and is currently at work on a project about walking women in 19th century literature. Amanda?
All right, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And pull up my PowerPoint. So my talk today is called Honest Sentiment, Little Women on Screen, and the Problem of the Sentimental. So like most reviewers, when Greta Gerwig's 2019 adaptation of Little Women debuted in 2019, A.O. Scott, writing for the New York Times, lauded it. He called it in his review, generous, sincere, full of critical attention and honest sentiment. While I agree with his assessment, I was caught as a 19th century scholar by the phrase honest sentiment because of the qualifier he felt compelled to include. Adding honest reveals a common critical discomfort with sentiment, or the sentimental in general. Little Women, standing as a sentimental work closely tied to its status as a girl's book and of course to its female author, has long tethered it and its film adaptations firmly to the sphere of women's culture, a position that allows it to be simultaneously beloved and belittled. Based on the critical reception of the more recent film adaptations, whoops, jumped ahead there. These cultural hierarchies remain fairly intact, I'm going to argue. And so while the most recent film has an audience and critical reception much more open to the stories of women's lives than did previous adaptations, there still remains a discomfort with the sentimental, and hence Scott's qualification of honest sentiment. This continued popular rejection of the sentimental tells us more, I think, about our own contemporary culture than it does about the tone of Little Women or any of its adaptations. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So my paper relies on a history of the sentimental, its triumph as an 18th century ideal of refined emotion, crucial to moral understanding, and later its eventual expulsion from the realm of artistic excellence. And I want to focus on particularly the latter. But quickly, and I'm sure many of you know this history, but the 17th and 18th century thinking held the sentimental as a mode essential to an ethical human civilization and as a crucial part of masculinity. The man of feeling was a thing to be praised. And that approach continued through the beginning of the 19th century. Little Women, the novel's publication in 1868, places it at a transitional time when the linkage between women's literature and the sentimental was beginning to be cemented, and the sentimental, coincidentally, right, was beginning to earn critical derision for what was seen as its facile emotion and lack of artistic restraint. Such judgments were, of course, strongly associated with gender and the existence of the scribbling women, to use Hawthorne's term, who were so good at writing the books people loved to read. In the novel itself, the sentimental comes in for explicit, mostly affectionate critique, with Alcott associating sentimental with romantic love, particularly the romantic feelings expressed by men, which early on Jo sees as threatening because of the fate they portend to her and her sisters. So a late example occurs in Under the Umbrella, when Professor Bear asks her to address him as thou, and Jo asks, isn't thou a little sentimental? To which Professor Bear answers, sentimental? Yes, thank God, we Germans believe in sentiment. How this reads depends, of course, on how we read the entire shift in Jo's character that takes place between the beginning to the end. For those who read the end as a capitulation to gender norms and market expectations and nothing more, then the sentimental can remain highly suspect in this novel. If we read Professor Bear as a wise figure from whom Jo can learn, then embracing the sentimental may be one such lesson. Jo's and Alcott's ambivalence toward sentimentality would be replaced as the century wore on and a new one began with utter rejection of it. The early 20th century critical sphere placed the sentimental low on the hierarchy of modes of writing. Philip Fisher, writing in the 1980s, argues that in the late 19th century, the distinction was made, I have this, let me pull this up over here on the left. The distinction was made between high and low popular culture, between art and kitsch, and involved the claim that art invented patterns of feeling, while kitsch, with its stereotypes of familiar feelings, played to the appetites already in existence. The claim that the sentimental, which is closely aligned with kitsch, gives the audience what it already knows and loves, that it plays the role of a kind of literary comfort food, was an important part of its developing negative definition. So too is the idea that the sentimental is dishonest emotion. James Baldwin famously established this definition of the sentimental in his essay, Everybody's Protest novel, in which he brings in Little Women for a brief but meaningful cameo in his excoriation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, defining the sentimental along the way. He writes, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very bad novel, and that's over here on the right, having much in common with Little Women. Sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive emotion, is the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel. The wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart. We see here how the sentimental gets harnessed to dishonesty, to affectation, to performed emotion beyond what is real, and why a critic like A.O. Scott needs to include the qualifier honest in his praise of an adaptation employing sentiment. So while the stink of the sentimental, the ghost of Baldwin's definition, still hangs over our critical press, the scholarly approach, of course, has changed. As Beverly Lyon Clark reminds us, feminists, quote, feminists have revalued sentiment and sentimentality. And she points out that as feminist scholars became more interested in communities of women, to borrow Nina Auerbach's term, and the internal ideological struggles within works of literature, like Little Women has gotten a much needed second look. But has that carried over to the popular press, to movie reviewers, to think pieces in Slate, Atlantic Monthly, New York Magazine? Not really. My look at movie reviews suggests that critics still feel the need to distance themselves from the sentimental, even as they praise a film that has elements of it, and even as they mark themselves as explicitly feminist. With the sentimental still a thing to be avoided and still hovering around the cultural understanding of what Little Women in all its forms is, reviewers end up defending Little Women from unstated accusations of sentimentality, often tripping over themselves to both confirm and distance the text's association with a mode that still makes, quote, serious critics uncomfortable. We see them using sentimental adjacent words like sweet, saccharine, and defending against unstated charges of dishonest sentiment, while often confirming Fisher's account that the sentimental has come to represent lower forms of art that do not, quote, invent new ideas. I want to briefly touch on the reception of Gillian Armstrong's 1994 adaptation. But for brevity's sake, I'll just look at one of the more influential critics of the time, and that's Roger Ebert and his review of that film. Reviewers like Ebert, I think if I look, when I was looking at several of them, clearly expected the film to be overly sentimental, as Roger Ebert lets us know in his review. Let me pull up some of his language here. He writes that the 1994 version is a surprisingly sharp and intelligent telling of Louisa May Alcott's famous story, and not the soft-edged children's movie it might appear. Later, he writes that the very title summons up preconceptions of treacly do-gooders in a smarmy children's story, and some of the early shots in Little Women do little to discourage them. But this movie is not smarmy, not do-gooding, and only a little treacly. He mentions the scene where the girls gather around their mother to read Mr. March's letter in the opening, saying it has, quote, all the spontaneity of a Kodak ad. That scene is also mentioned in the New York Times, Janet Maslin's review from that year as well, and talked about in the same way. Smarmy, treacly, in other words, the worst version of the sentimental. He must name it before he goes on to say the film is not actually those things, or maybe just a little of those things. Ebert is clearly working from a bias against stories about women in general. He writes in a passage that wouldn't make it past the editor today, I hope, quote, there isn't a lot of overt action in their lives, but then that's typical of the 19th century novel about women, which essentially shows them sitting endlessly in parlors, holding deep conversations about their hopes, their dreams, their beliefs, and mostly their marriage destinies. And finally, he admits, Little Women grew on me. At first, I was grumpy, thinking it was going to be too sweet and devout. So Armstrong's Little Women, while beloved by many, including many of my own students who were not born even when it came out, but I've come to see it, was generally well reviewed, including by Ebert. But as you can see, some of those reviews were begrudgingly given, crafted with early 20th century assumptions about the sentimental firmly in place. Greta Gerwig's adaptation in 2019 emerged in a very different context for women's cultural products. And while there's a proudly feminist bent to many of the reviews, that feminism often seems to want to exclude elements of what has been traditionally sentimental, or at the very least, be operating in a defensive posture about the film's sentimentality. I've already mentioned Scott's qualified compliment about the film having, quote, honest sentiment. Likewise, Thomas Laughley, writing for Variety, comments that the film will earn your tears. In the background of such claims lurks the threat that there are other movies like this one that don't earn your tears, that don't employ or produce honest sentiment. While utterly admiring, Laughley's review dances on the edge of saying the film employs another pejorative aspect of the sentimental, that it comforts rather than challenges the viewer. Let me pull up some of the language that she uses. So the movie is cozy and comfy. Gerwig's nonlinear plotting evokes nostalgia and is laced with soothing cadences. Gerwig caringly feeds the audience the story. Laughley praises how Gerwig grasps and transposes the pleasant nature of the story that resembles the inviting warmth of a blanket on a cold winter day. Kate Erblin likewise emphasizes something similar, writing that Little Women offers its own delightful storybook polish in its own unique terms, and what a comfort it is. Peter DeBruge posits the film as perfect for those who don't want to be shocked out of their current realities. Quote, Gerwig's version may in fact play better with adults, especially those who find mainstream movies too salacious and immoral. Little Women is just the opposite, a wholesome, kind-hearted tale of generosity and good manners. One can't help but see this as damning with faint praise, a summary that misses the radical nature of the film and the source material and places it into the realm of the sentimental that is the opposite of, quote, great art, according to many 20th century critics. Those that do praise the film more forcefully end up writing about Little Women in terms of negation, what it is not. So Erblin writes that Gerwig doesn't get heavy-handed or preachy in her affectionate look at the March sisters, while Constance Snow claims that Marmee is made less saccharine than in some other adaptations by the fact that she's played by Laura Dern, who adds a note of desperation to her sweetness. In other words, this 20th century attack on the sentimental haunts these reviews still, so that reviewers, in praising the film, must be explicit about what it is not. At times, they're even apologetic and defensive. DeBruge ends his review by writing, call me corny, but Little Women hooks me anytime. Corny, of course, is the vernacular for the sentimental. functions here as a way for the author to praise the film without defending the very thing that gives it a lot of its power, which is its sentimentality. While emotion that falls under the moving amorphous definition of the sentimental, like sincere, familial, or romantic love or nostalgia, may still be difficult for critics in 2019 to stomach, anger is an emotion that is not. Anger, whether Marmie's, Joe's, or even Amy's, is the sentiment most discussed from the 2019 version. Unlike most of her predecessors, Gerwig included Marmie's line from the novel, "I've been angry every day of my life." She even dropped the qualifier from the book because in the book, Marmie says nearly every day of my life. And Scott included it in his review, a comment on that line. He quoted it, and it was quoted in many of the reviews. Sarah Blackwood wrote a wonderful analysis in the New Yorker titled "Little Women and the Marmie Problem," working from this line or around this line. And all of them, a lot of these that include the discussion of anger oppose the anger to sweetness and didacticism. In other words, anger is feminist and righteous. The other aspects of the sentimental, love between sisters, romantic love, nostalgia for childhood, not so much. As I hope is clear, this paper is not really about whether Little Women and its adaptations employ the sentimental, because the word and the concept are so charged and so malleable. But it is a shame, I think, that the culture remains so eager to dismiss the sentimental in order to prove the case, in the case of critics, artistic taste and cultural bona fides. Anger has for so long been excluded from the portraits of women, unlike men for whom anger remains a normal and desirable filmic quality. So it's admirable to see Gerwig revive that aspect of the novel. But the more traditionally sentimental scenes that feature love, forgiveness, grief, especially among a group of women, critics are still not sure what to do with them, and either work hard to insist that they are not sentimental, by which they mean that they are sincere and realistic, or that they are sentimental and how quaint they are for it, categorizing the films as pleasurable but not artistically adventurous. It is interesting to note that while the film, Gerwig, and some cast members were nominated for Oscars, the country's most prestigious film awards, the film won only the Oscar for costume design, a nod to the historical, though decorative, aspect of the film. Critics loved the film, maybe even felt sentimental about it themselves. But does that feeling, that sentiment translate to artistic respect, or does it signal the negation of it? For some critics, even today, the question is still an uncomfortable one. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Next we have Aryssa Damron. Aryssa is a children's librarian with the District of Columbia Public Library. Her scholarship focuses on Louisa May Alcott, underrepresented women in children's picture books, and mindfulness. Aryssa?
Oh, 1 second, sorry. Thank you so much for having me here today. Like Mark said, I'm a public librarian with a special interest in Alcott and especially Little Women. My paper today is titled Redeeming Amy, Finding Abigail May, Little Women 2019, and The Youngest Sister. Despite being an actual librarian and therefore a lifelong book girl, I have always actually identified more as an Amy March, which I know is a very strange thing to hear, because despite the fact that Little Women, her best work, has been adapted to stage and screen and book numerous times, you would be hard-pressed to find any other woman that identifies so strongly as the youngest sister, Amy March, rather than the protagonist, Jo. That was until Greta Gerwig's 2019 film hit theaters on Christmas Day, and suddenly being Amy March wasn't such an admission of guilt. In her writing and directing of Florence Pugh as Amy March, Greta Gerwig's able to tap into the semi-autobiographical elements of the entire March family in ways that other adaptations have avoided in favor of focusing solely on Jo. And in doing that, she's able to illuminate the reality of Abigail May Alcott, known best during her life as May, and the critical role she and Louisa played in each other's lives. In semi-autobiographical works such as Little Women, one is prone to sympathizing with and even idolizing the protagonist more so than any other characters. Much like Jane Austen's Elizabeth Bennet, Louisa May Alcott's Josephine March quickly steals the hearts of readers. This is especially true for the type of reader that's drawn to work like Pride and Prejudice or Little Women centuries after its publication, those voracious readers yearning for representation on the page. In Little Women, they're given the patron saint of women who read, Jo March. Therefore, the sisters of Jo, especially Meg and Amy, are often the subject of ridicule from the modern Jo Marches of the world. But even as the conversations around feminism have changed in the century and a half since the release of the book, there's always been one March sister that seemed a little irredeemable, Amy. Because of this, the real woman who inspired her, Louisa May Alcott's younger sister, was often forgotten and unexplored. Abigail May Alcott, later known best as May, which is, we'll note, an anagram for Amy, was born on July 26, 1840, and named after her mother. She lived a fascinating and too short life. An artist from a young age, she taught art to Daniel Chester French, who would go on to sculpt the Monument of Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington, D.C. Like Louisa, she was also an author. A painting of hers was also exhibited in the 1879 Paris Salon. Her trips to Europe, where she was able to study art more intensely and learn from the masters, was possible due only to the success of Little Women. It is a heartwarming thought, especially considering that in 1863, following the publication of Hospital Sketches, Louisa May Alcott wrote of her success, "I may yet pay all the debts, fix the house, send May to Italy, and keep the folks cozy, as I've said I would so long, yet so hopelessly." In 1878, May married a Swiss businessman approximately 16 years her junior, and in November 1879, they had a daughter, Louisa May, who they called Lulu. May died just 7 weeks later, just after Christmas, and her daughter Lulu was raised by Louisa May Alcott back in the States. Lulu was nearly 11 when Louisa, her caretaker and aunt, died in March 1888, and she joined her father in his home country. Yet instead of that story, one of a young artist, a new mother, and a woman who had the world ahead of her, and because of the nature of Little Women and the period of their lives it covers, Amy March is often destined to be the petulant younger sister and nothing else. While the antagonism between Amy and Jo might lead the readers to believe that was the case for the entire life of the Alcott sisters, biography shows that was not the case. Girls grow up to be women, and sometimes sisters grow up to be friends. In Gerwig's adaptation, we get a better glimpse of the Amy March that Louisa May Alcott, knowing her sister as an adult as well as a girl, may have imagined. In Gerwig's 2019 adaptation, May Alcott gets her due because Amy March gets her due. Her full story may not fit into the plot constraints of the classic novel focused on their teenage years, but through a strong casting, inventive narrative structure, and artistic eye, Gerwig redeems Amy and gives May her moment to shine as well. Gerwig leans heavily into viewing Little Women as an autobiographical work, and in her film essentially transforms Jo March into Louisa May Alcott. In the final scene, we see the initial printing of Little Women as Jo watches from just outside the window. This not only serves the film's protagonist, Jo, but also the sisters of Jo, who are often not as explored as autobiographically throughout the films. By blurring the lines between fiction and autobiography for one character, Gerwig invites the audience to wonder about the true origins of the other March sisters, not just the most obvious protagonist. The success of Gerwig's Amy March lies in two places: her casting of Florence Pugh and Gerwig's own skill as a writer and director. Gerwig not only saves Amy from succumbing to her brattiness in every moment, but she enlivens her with monologues, artistic moments, and humorous scene pairings to truly capture the ways of Amy March and May Alcott. Pugh's performance was widely celebrated. In The Atlantic, David Sims declared, "The entire ensemble is terrific, but Pugh is the standout, turning Amy, long the novel's problem character, given to stoking spiteful sibling rivalries, into a heroine as rich and compelling as Jo." Unlike the 1994 adaptation, Gerwig has Pugh play Amy March throughout the film, from youthful child to married woman, which allows the audience to connect with Pugh's strong performance throughout, rather than asking them to reacclimate to a new actress halfway through the film. Due to the genius of Gerwig's structuring of this film, using connections rather than linear time to jump between scenes, when the audience meets Pugh, she's not being bratty and complaining about wanting presents on Christmas, which is typically how adaptations begin. Rather, she's a sophisticated woman traveling through Europe with her aunt. By introducing Amy this way, Gerwig subverts the audience's memories of Amy as a young, dramatic brat. It's also an homage to May Alcott in her own travels through Europe, especially as it follows directly a scene of Jo March selling her stories, which is how Louisa was ultimately able to pay for her sister May to travel. The parallel structure of the 2019 film allows Amy March to shine. Rather than seeing her grow up and change over time, the audience gets to see a drastic change between the Amy that is proper and sophisticated in Europe and the Amy that is two scenes later complaining about how her nose will simply not look refined. That comparison assures the viewer that hope lies ahead for Amy March. Another exquisite use of scene pairing done by Gerwig that highlights Amy's character and therefore makes her and Alcott, her Alcott origin sister, more interesting, comes about 80 minutes into the film when we see Amy confront Laurie in Europe about her own feelings for him. And then we jump to the March house of years past and see a young Amy creating a plaster mold of her foot for Laurie. In the first scene of this pairing, we see Amy exhibiting an enviable maturity, asking Laurie about his plans. Laurie offers that he might write an opera. Sensible Amy, and we know that she is sensible because of her reaction, quickly rebuffs him. And when the conversation turns to Fred Vaughn, Amy's beau, the scene is set for tension. Amy's responses are not only brilliantly delivered by Pugh, but by framing them with the following scene, Gerwig gives the audience no choice but to love Amy March, and therefore start to ask questions about who inspired her. "It's just mean of you," Pugh says, standing tall, sketchpad in hand. "I've been second to Jo my whole life in everything, and I will not be the person you settle for just because you cannot have her. I won't do it. Not when I've spent my entire life loving you." That repetition of "not when," the slight warble in Pugh's brave demeanor, and then the scene cuts to the past, and we see her years before, bangs and all, casting a mold of her foot for the boy next door. Not only is this a wonderful physical representation of the line, "I've spent my entire life loving you," but it also helps navigate the inevitable gap that viewers feel when watching Laurie, the male lead of the movie, not end up with the female lead, Jo. The use of this pairing, along with Amy's interaction at the window earlier in the film following her punishments for drawing at school, allow the viewer to get acclimated to the feelings Amy has for Laurie earlier rather than later. And these scenes make Amy less of the villain who stole Laurie away and works to build the Amy-Laurie romantic arc as strongly, if not stronger, than it does to build and then dismantle Jo and Laurie's relationship to each other. The positioning of scenes by Gerwig not only makes the classic novel more structurally interesting to those of us ardent fans who know it well, but it also allows Amy to come to life and into her own womanhood without being, as the character fears, second to Jo in everything. Choices of Gerwig's that make Amy likable rather than a romantic rival of the protagonist ultimately serve May Alcott for the better. Her story benefits from a renewed interest in her fictionalized counterpart. Another element of Amy March's character in the film that helps illuminate the story of May Alcott is the intentional focus on her art. A key part of May Alcott's story is her art. While most adaptations of Little Women give Amy her artistic flair, few do it with the care, precision, and esteem of Gerwig's adaptation. Gerwig's Amy March does not just like to draw flowers and paint pretty pictures. She's an artist, and she struggles with that in context to the art of the day. But when we see her work, we understand that it is in fact good art, well done work, even if the art movements of the day wanted something a little different. Take, for example, the scene in the 2019 film where Amy is painting in Paris. May Alcott and her sister did travel abroad together. Though it is often not highlighted in conversations about the film, Gerwig and her team employed an art student to create the works done by Amy. In fact, that artist, Kelly Carmody, did both of the paintings in that famous scene in Paris where Amy is comparing her realistic work to the more impressionistic work. The use of one artist for both paintings highlights an undercurrent of art criticism in the film and in May's life. Style is just style, but there is raw talent necessary to create it. While Amy may see the impressionistic work as more desirable, a modern audience, like Gerwig knew she would have in Us, would understand that Amy had talent and was a talented artist nonetheless. The fact that Carmody did both of the paintings as well helps an informed viewer identify the differences between the two paintings as stylistic choices rather than a question of talent. The stylistic divide is also likely representative of May Alcott's reality. As Karen Chernick wrote for Hypoallergic, May was still painting in the academic style she learned at the Académie Julienne when she died. And because she was supporting herself with her artwork, she didn't have the financial luxury of experimenting with the avant-garde mode of looser brushstrokes favored by the Impressionists. In a later scene, during which Amy gives her famous speech on marriage being an economic proposition, the audience sees some of Amy's work in progress. A floral painting, a still life of pears, and those are accompanied by the real life objects. By pairing those together, the viewer is able to recognize a good likeness. They see that Amy is doing a good job of representing those on the canvas. Artistic genius like the Brontes, maybe not, but good art nonetheless. In the spotlight that is literary history, it must be really hard to be the sister of Louisa May Alcott, even harder to be a sister of Jo March. Ultimately, by bringing an increased complexity to the character of Amy March through directorial choices, Gerwig allows a modern audience to approach her and the fascinating aspects of her character in its autobiographical nature without having to choose between Amy and Jo. Little Women isn't a story of competition. It's a story of sisters. And by fleshing out the most often antagonistic character, Amy, Gerwig is able to redeem the character for viewers and encourage the exploration of the woman who inspired her, an artist and sister lost too soon, May Alcott. Thank you.
Thank you, Aryssa. And next we have Jaclyn Carver. Jaclyn Carver is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Iowa. Her dissertation examines the abolitionist inclinations of Alcott's hospital sketches. Jaclyn?
Thanks, Mark. And thank you all for spending your afternoon listening to us presenting. And I'm really excited to talk about all of our various papers in the Q&A. So I'll just get started. Greta Gerwig's 2019 Little Women film begins with the Louisa May Alcott quote, "I've had lots of troubles, so I write jolly tales." Accordingly, the film's first scene introduces several troubles for Jo March. There are editors, for one, as the editor, Mr. Dashwood, ruthlessly edits her story, creating a curious drumbeat as he slaps each of her hard-won pages on his desk. And there's the ever-present worry over money. Having put Jo through the toil of watching him read her work, Dashwood underpays her for the privilege. This is introduced as the particular problem of being a writer who is a woman. The editor doesn't believe for a second the fiction Jo spins for him, that the writing is not hers, but that it instead belongs to a friend. Indeed, it's his belief that Jo is the author that empowers him to pay her less. Among these anticipated tensions, since the Alcott quote at the beginning had prepared us for lots of troubles, writing jolly tales emerges not as a solution, but as yet another trouble. As Jo braces for a rejection of her submission, prepared by the drumbeat sound of the editor depositing her pages on his desk, he accepts her submission, but with conditions. Jo has her characters repent of their misdeeds, but he objects. Having just been through the Civil War, he says, quote, "People want to be amused, not preached at," end quote. Of all Jo's troubles in the first scene, it's this trouble of entertaining while instructing that proves the most durable. As the following scene, which sees the March sisters giving up their holiday meal to a needy family, even money troubles can be forgotten when you're rich in other ways. But this problem of what to write and how, creating something worthwhile but also pleasing, proves trouble for both Gerwig's Jo and Alcott herself, as the tension between moral tales and jolly ones threatens to overtake the work. causing the work to favor morality or joviality too much, and potentially discouraging the woman writing from writing at all. As I turn to speaking of Alcott's works, I'll follow the film's lead by turning to wartime morality, specifically 2 series of travel letters by Alcott, Hospital Sketches, and Letters from the Mountains, both of which appeared in the abolitionist newspaper, The Commonwealth. In both works, Alcott revises her letters home into serials, and with the mountain letters, consciously attempts to be funny, but in her view becoming rowdy, which she takes as instructive for her development as a professional writer. I offer these 2 works as a time when Alcott ponders the tension between moral instructional tales and jolly ones. In the first scene of Gerwig's film, the war is evoked as a recent memory, one that motivates the public to seek out jolly tales as a balm to the recent hard years. Alcott's Hospital Sketches and Letters from the Mountains, however, were adapted from her personal letters in the first half of 1863 in the middle of the war. And they were published in the Commonwealth, a Boston newspaper which could be found circulating in Union camps. Unlike Joe, who seems to have turned up hopefully but uninvited to the editor's office, stories in hand, Alcott had the advantage of having her work solicited for the pages of the Commonwealth. At around the time Alcott returns to Concord from her nursing position in Georgetown in January 1863, family friend Frank Sanborn took over editing the Commonwealth. The paper's first editor had goals: establishing the free republic without slavery as intended by the Constitution, foremost among them. To these Republican aspirations, Sanborn adds his desire to make the Commonwealth into a family newspaper, a potentially fraught task for a man who was not only implicated in John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, but who was also arrested by congressional police after his refusal to testify, connections that were publicly known, including to potential readers of the paper. The Commonwealth be a new abolitionist voice for the middle of the Civil War, a voice raised in support of immediate emancipation of the enslaved by any means, including violence, in 1859 at Harper's Ferry and in 1863 on battlefields, and which urged its readers to see the current war as a necessary project of restoring the Republic. With Sanborn as editor, John Brown biographer James Redpath as printer, and fellow John Brown ally George L. Stearns providing the paper's funding, nothing else would do for the paper. Into this dramatic balancing of Republican principles violently defended and the necessity to make such materials appropriate for and pleasing to the family, Alcott sent her letters in 1863. Through Sanborn, Alcott had a way into the Commonwealth, and she was also keenly aware of the paper's exigencies as she shaped her letters to fit the paper. As the Commonwealth delivered immediate emancipation ideas into family homes, so too did Alcott provide both, quote, laughter and tears, and contrast between comic incidents and the tragic experience, with Hospital Sketches as reviewers of the letters series observed. Thinking of Hospital Sketches as a travel series informed by the Commonwealth's abolitionist fervor, the intermingling of comedy and tragedy is indeed a striking and impressive feat. Rather than expressing alarm at Alcott's tribulation periwinkle character for broadcasting the fervor of a, quote, red-hot abolitionist, for example, when a rebel soldier gruffly refuses her charitable offer to help him wash in the first letter, more timid abolitionists could latch on to the bittersweet scenes with the mortally wounded soldier John, whose reason for enlisting is a heartfelt passion for a cause that goes unnamed. Having met success with Hospital Sketches' popularity and James Redpath's offer to bring a volume of Hospital Sketches in fall 1863, in the meantime, Alcott determined to strike twice in the Commonwealth with another series of letters, this one based on her 1861 journey to New Hampshire's White Mountains. While Hospital Sketches' Trib Periwinkle travels to a Washington, D.C. nursing position in search of something to do for the war, the heroine of Letters from the Mountains determines to climb the famed Mount Washington, a dangerous ascent recently made a little tamer by the completion of a carriage road, one of the nation's first tourist destinations, complete with hotels, a site of scientific research, and once the home of a mountaintop newspaper aptly named Among the Clouds. Even now, Mount Washington is known for its frightening weather. At the time of Alcott's visit, the new carriage road had not quite made the mountain safe, only safer, as her narrator would discover. Though principally known to historians of the White Mountains as a first account of the carriage road, Alcott's letter series is notably concerned with characters, both mountain residents and tourists, more often than with the scenery, since, as Alcott's Spencer narrator puts it, quote, romance and rain don't agree as well as one could desire, end quote. Indeed, in Alcott's telling, even the mountains are characters. They bid each other goodnight in a friendly exchange Alcott calls the family circle, and later Alcott reveals one of the mountains, Mount Moriah, to be an incorrigible gossip. The hospital sketches letters, as they appeared in the Commonwealth, launch in media res right into A Day at the Hospital, details about wartime travel to DC from Boston added later to make the Red Path volume's first chapter. However, the first mountain letter is principally concerned with travel by train, the length of the tiresome day's journey from Boston to the mountain hotel, momentarily outdoing the beauty of the arrival into the mountains. While a travel series might be expected to treat the moment of arrival with all the fine language the author can muster to the task, Alcott treats it as a matter of course. Of the final leg of the journey into the mountains, Alcott writes, quote, stare about me at 80 miles of wonderful scenery, and at 6 o'clock stop before a hotel as if riding in my own carriage, end quote. Though Alcott tells readers the scenery is increasingly beautiful as coastal plain becomes hills, becomes mountains, she does not show it. She does not even marvel at the convenience, as an exhausted traveler, of being dropped off at her hotel by train. Instead, she writes, quote, the hotel is a convenient impertinence, up there among the everlasting hills, and I am disgusted with it as I enjoy its comforts, end quote. Here, Alcott identifies the hotel as out of place among the mountains, a marker of solace and incongruency equally. This tension between the mountains and the hotel, between natural beauty and human efforts to dull it into tourist fare, appears throughout the mountain letters, as nature threatens to ruin the hotel guest's good time, even as it provides a scene of amusement. The hotel guest, including Alcott's narrator, must take shelter indoors at a moment's notice as a pretty gray cloud matures into a roaring storm right above their heads. Even indoors, they do not feel safe from the uproar outside. During the melee, the hotel guests nervously pick up various distractions, our own narrator coolly ripping the trimming from a hat, only to yelp in terror along with the rest of the guests at a particularly close lightning strike. Thereafter, Alcott writes of the guests scrambled to be rid of every single piece of metal jewelry and clothing that might draw lightning and worsen the crisis. The direct train line and the hotel prove not quite feats of human ingenuity or accomplishment, but they are impositions. More impositions follow the guests up the carriage road. The anticipated journey up to Mount Washington, the highest peak in the U.S. Northeast, waits until the third letter. Though Alcott's narrator goes up with a party of 5, and the start of the journey is rather enjoyable and scenic. Sorry, party of 45. That's a lot more people than 5. The party feels increasingly uncomfortable in the majesty of the mountains. The grand view is simply too much. Alcott writes of the sight of, quote, earth, rocks, trees, water, mist, and snow, hurled pell-mell together, end quote, a view of chaos that she also calls indescribably strange. Her narrator is not fearful of the deep valley the carriage could slip into at any moment, but she describes an adjacent feeling of awe. Despite the unsettling journey upward, the narrator's cousin Willis, a fictionalized May cousin, convinces her to hide her face from the grand finale, the view from the mountain summit, until the party reaches the very end of the road. Here, even with Cousin Willis's and the reader's expectations that the mountain peak will be an absolute shock, Alcott focuses on the surrounding characters. There at the mountain's peak, Alcott's narrator once again feels the convenient impertinence of the tourist trappings. Whereas the ascent up the carriage road left the party awestruck, she listens to the other tourists who are variously taking in the mountain view, discussing smashed hats and how much the land before them would cost to buy, or fussing at children who sat in the sandwiches. Finally, Alcott's narrator laughs, as the sublime was overpowered by the ridiculous. Not the reaction Cousin Willis was hoping for, but probably also not the mountaintop experience Alcott's narrator was expecting either. Alcott didn't like the series, writing in her journal in summer 1863 that, quote, though they sold the paper, I was heartily ashamed of them, end quote. The fourth one, featuring marriage advice from one of the mountain's older inhabitants, ironic and welcomed only in jest since Alcott's narrator is not in the mountains to get married, was the last one. and Alcott reflected that she'd, quote, stopped in the middle, resolving never again to try to be funny, lest I should be rowdy and nothing more, end quote. She calls this a lesson that she hopes will do me good. I've puzzled over what Alcott found so unsatisfactory about the series. It sold a paper, after all. At most, it is perhaps a surprise that Alcott included no passionate descriptions of the view from the mountaintop, despite excitement about and interest in the completion of the road. This is perhaps even more surprising since the road was completed during Alcott's own visit. But the narrator's skepticism of the experiences is one of its most interesting qualities, as is how the mountain letters and hospital sketches run across one another, each playing at the margins of the other. The first of the mountain letters is a time-stamped journey into the mountains, and the first chapter of the collected volume of hospital sketches relates wartime travel struggles, a topic Alcott had originally skipped. Alcott's mountain letters narrator ascends a still precarious mountain named after the first US president. Meanwhile, hospital sketches Trib Periwinkle visits the new Statue of Freedom sitting unfinished in the mud, as in her view and the view of the Commonwealth newspaper, the nation's Republican project remain uncompleted. And there's an interesting gap between the mountain letters I can't quite account for as Alcott changes genres in the middle of the series. The Commonwealth printed a mountain letter each week in late July and August 1863, except between the third and fourth letters, when an Alcott poem appears instead of the fourth letter. I haven't been able to discover why this was. It could have been Sanborn's choice or just a coincidence, but I do wonder if it was the fourth letter that caused her to despair of the series, or if it was the third one where the ridiculous overpowers the sublime, just as the mountain weather had overtaken the hotel guest, and just as the Commonwealth's attempt to fold the message of immediate emancipation of the enslaved into a family paper threatened to wither due to lasting fear of John Brown. If the mountain letters were rowdy and nothing more, is morality what's missing? This is parallel to the tension that ends the first scene of Gerwig's Little Women. The editor, Dashwood, admonishes that, quote, people want to be amused, not preached at, and presumes the impossibility of doing both. The film locates this challenge as one of the many troubles of the woman who writes, as Gerwig's narrative layers Jo's story with Alcott's own. In Gerwig's film, the tension between jolly and moral tales is as much an economic proposition as marriage is. Amy first talks about marriage in this way, but Jo confirms it by the end. Just as the editor had once proclaimed at the beginning of the film that people prefer frivolity to moralizing, he now insists that Jo's character can't simply be single. To sell the book, Jo agrees to make a marriage happen, but she does it in the most frivolous way possible, in a carriage parody of the airport run trope where the couple reconciles at the last minute before one of them jets off forever. Of course, this is a version of what Alcott did in the Little Women novel in response to readers' desires that Jo get married. She conjured what she called a funny match for her out of perversity. Though several reviewers of the film ended up wondering whether Gerwig's Jo really does get married by revealing the marriage ending as an artifice. Gerwig's film makes Jo's marriage to Professor Bayer matter less than her accomplishment of having written a book that is printed and sold on bookshelves and for which she earns money. As Jo observes her book's printing, the negotiation with the editor and the capitulation regarding the ending fade into just part of the process of professional writing, and the ending that matters is Jo holding her own book. Thank you, and I'll be very curious if any of you have visited Mount Washington.
All right, thank you, Jaclyn. And finally, today we have Heidi A. Lawrence. Heidi is a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow. Her thesis uses ecopsychology and its praxis, ecotherapy, to explore the relationships between humans and the non-human environment across a fantasy-reality continuum in a small selection of Madeleine L'Engle's novels. Her interests are in the field of children's and adolescent fiction, with diverse interests in fantasy and highly imaginative literature, as well as in more traditional authors such as L.M. Montgomery and Louisa May Alcott. She works as adjunct faculty at Brigham Young University. Heidi.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all of you for allowing me to make my first foray into Alcott studies and scholarship here. I hope you can hear me. Louisa May Alcott's short story, An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving, is a delightful series of comic mishaps surrounding the Bassett family, starting with an incorrect message that grandmother is dying and ending with catnip and wormwood in the Thanksgiving turkey stuffing. In stark contrast, director Graham Campbell's 2008 film adaptation of this short story for the Hallmark Channel is a drama focused on a family's struggle to adjust to and survive the death of husband and father. This results in a confrontation between grandmother Isabella and mother Mary, estranged because of Isabella's disapproval of Mary's marriage. The confrontation is brought about through the devices of Mary's imaginative daughter Tilly, an aspiring author. Reconciliation follows Mary's severe bout with scarlet fever. Indeed, because so little of Alcott's original short story remains, the film becomes what adaptation scholars Timothy Corrigan and Linda Hutcheon call filmic palimpsests. Corrigan explains that, like a manuscript palimpsest, a filmic palimpsest, quote, suggests a form of adaptation in which an original work may exist only as a trace or as an unseen foundation, end quote. Instead, closer examination suggests that screenwriter Shelley Evans adapts the short story as a framework from which to completely recreate some events in the novel Little Women. These rewritten events represent conflict or distress between Little Women and its readers of the last 150 years. Two conflicts which seem to be redesigned include Jo losing her opportunity to travel abroad and Laurie marrying Amy rather than Jo. Examining this film as a potential adaptation of Little Women instead of an adaptation of the short story raises questions about the purposes of adaptation, what audiences expect from an adaptation, and what risks the screenwriter takes in appearing to make such significant changes to an original text and to the content, values, and morals which readers may have come to expect from an author's work. The film draws immediate attention to audience expectations in its opening scenes as Tilly Bassett narrates a letter she is writing, which leads her into chapter 1 of her in-process novel about her family's situation. This seems to directly reference the opening scenes of the familiar and much-loved 1994 film adaptation of Little Women, where Robin Swickard's screenplay has Jo March narrating her family's story as she develops the novel which becomes the beloved Little Women. Evans' tone is more serious than the opening of the original short story and emphasizes the artist and creativity rather than drawing the viewer into humor. Adaptation scholar Linda Hutcheon argues that if, quote, an adaptation is perceived as lowering a story according to some imagined hierarchy of medium or genre, response is likely to be negative, end quote. Perhaps because the short story contained so much of what audiences could consider the ridiculous, Evans and Campbell worked to avoid the low status of humor through their dramatic alterations. Thus, instead of the humor of Alcott's original, Evans and Campbell's efforts suggest that they are elevating the short story to a higher plane by developing a film in which viewers will respond positively to the Alcott they expect: family, female authorship, and romance. Once audience expectations for the type of story have been met, Campbell and Evans set about meeting expectations for the content of the story, presumably creating that atmosphere which Campbell described as recognizable to Alcott aficionados across time. Using some of the character names from Alcott's short story, including Gad, Tilly, Prudence, and Saul, Evans builds two events that both match and change events in Little Women. The changes don't appear problematic unless viewed from a perspective which contextualizes them with the, quote, moral pap for the young, end quote, readers of Alcott recognize in her novels and stories for young people. Instead of the benefits of self-governance and sacrifice of one's own desires, which Alcott seems intent on conveying in the relevant scenes of the novel, Campbell and Evans' film seems to resolve audience tension by removing challenges and obstacles which characters might otherwise have faced or do face, by which Alcott seems to have illustrated moral growth in the novel. The first incident involves Alcott's refusal to allow Jo March the opportunity to travel to Europe to develop her writing. In Little Women, it is Jo's independence, described as going, quote, through the world with your elbows out and your nose in the air, end quote, and her attitude toward accepting favors, quote, they oppress and make me feel like a slave. I'd rather do everything for myself and be perfectly independent, end quote, that results in The Lost Chance. In Evans and Campbell's adaptation, by contrast, Tilly Bassett deliberately, if somewhat dishonestly, seeks out her grandmother's favors and finances and is invited to go abroad with her grandmother for several years, despite her own actions and speech, which sound as independent as anything Joe says, such as when Tilly condemns grandmother Isabella for buying the family farm in order to secure it for Tilly's mother. Rather than losing her opportunities, however, Tilly is elevated in status and is provided with greater opportunities through her grandmother's wealth, while her quieter, more ladylike sister Prue must remain at home. This reverses the situations of Joe and Amy as presented in Little Women. The second resolution of tension in the film, An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving, is by far the most important in the eyes of disgruntled readers of Little Women. It is well known that as Alcott began writing the second half of the novel, she recorded in her journal, quote, "Girls write to ask who the little women marry, as if that was the only end and aim of a woman's life. I won't marry Joe to Laurie to please anyone," end quote. Instead, Joe marries Friedrich Bahr at the end of the novel, disappointing many readers. Evans tackles this issue directly, drawing on a hint of lovering in the short story to justify her decision to reverse Alcott's decision about Joe's marriage. In Alcott's short story, Gad Hopkins comes into the Bassett yard pretending to be a bear. Just as the older Bassett boys are preparing to shoot at it, Tilly, quote, "flung open the door and ran straight into the arms of the bear who stood erect to receive her," end quote. She recognizes Gad and enjoys his prank, even when he insists that she gives him, quote, "a hearty kiss," as he thinks of her as his, quote, "little sweetheart." Based on this brief encounter, Evans' screenplay develops a much more romantic relationship between Tilly and Gad, which parallels Little Women rather than the short story. Gad, like Laurie, is the wealthy upper-class boy next door who has been Tilly's childhood friend. Like Laurie, Gad has been away at university. Upon returning, he proposes to Tilly, just as Laurie proposes to Joe following his graduation. However, in contrast to Joe's response, Tilly says yes to Gad, who then promises to wait for her while she travels with grandmother Isabella. Evans has at last put right the wrong Joe perpetrated against Laurie in the eyes of many readers. Evans has been very free with her plot differences throughout the screenplay, with the result that these events do not represent the events of Alcott's original short story at all. However, it is important to acknowledge that films and film adaptations, like the literature they adapt, quote, "can be considered as sites of production and the circulation of discourses," end quote, that they are creative works in their own right. In light of such creative license, then, perhaps the same might be said of Campbell and Evans' adaptation of this short story, as was said by Karen Hollinger and Aryssa Winterhalter about Swickard's 1994 Little Women, that, quote, "given the number of contemporary women who testify to the importance of Little Women in their adolescent development, the adapters may have rewritten the novel the way contemporary women wish Alcott had written it," end quote. However, audiences who watch An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving and find satisfaction in Evans and Campbell's apparent new version of Little Women may come away with little to no awareness of the cultural setting and values in which the short story is situated. For instance, the Bassett family of the short story is not overly dramatic about the events they encounter. There is very little reference to finances, and the children, including Tilly, have been carefully trained in their respective, if gendered, roles as farmers and housekeepers who are considered mature enough and capable enough to be left alone while Mr. and Mrs. Bassett make an emergency trip to visit what they think is their dying grandmother. In addition to the importance of hard work, the family revels in humor. This sense of work, fun, and play, however, is missing from much of Evans and Campbell's film. Campbell states in an interview behind the scenes that, quote, "Louisa May Alcott's work is so well written that it speaks to anybody. Anybody could understand it if they'd read it 400 years earlier, and they'll be able to understand it 400 years from now," end quote. This implies that Campbell thinks viewers will expect to see something similar to Little Women, set in a similar time period and containing similar events, although the short story bears little resemblance to the novel. Shirley Marcellonis argues that, quote, nothing shows differences in cultural climate so clearly as the transformation of earlier fiction into films designed to appeal to a modern popular audience, end quote. The elimination of the humor from Campbell and Evans' adaptation of An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving in favor of inserting events which reversed events in Little Women suggests that the screenwriter and director anticipated that the humor and moralistic nature of the short story would not appeal to their viewing audience. While the film's happy endings might satisfy audiences who have yearned for Joe to travel abroad, and especially for Laurie and Joe to marry, the revision of Alcott's events implies more than simply a new, happier Little Women. In addition to appearing to have left out the humor which permeates the story, Evans and Campbell appear to have excised the values of hard work, thrift, and education in tasks fitting one's future situation and social class, which Alcott suggests in much of her writing for young people. Certainly, Tilly Bassett of the short story is capable of caring for herself and her siblings while her parents are absent. She works hard and has been taught the skills her mother expects her to need in her social circumstances, including the planning and execution of a large holiday meal. There is no suggestion that Tilly expects to eventually find her way smoothed by quick financial gain. Tilly Bassett of the film, however, is accused at one point of never doing her chores around home, and tardiness to her place of employment is a recurring event in the film. Rather than caring for herself, the film suggests her marriage to Gad will bring her immediately into wealth and a high social standing in her community. As the wife of a well-to-do man, it is unlikely that she will be expected to work for the financial support of her household, and her relaxed attitude towards so-called domestic duties hints that in the future she will be happily supplied with servants. In contrast, it is difficult to imagine Joe March lolling in the lap of luxury rather than, quote, reveling in a wilderness of boys, end quote. In this way, the film An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving seems to have left behind the expectations of an early 19th century rural household. The short story is set in the early 1820s. It also seems to have left behind Alcott's own humorous realism and the morals which she often embedded in her writing for young people. In fact, she condemns the trope of rising in status by easy money from the suddenly appearing benefactor, as happens to Tilly in the film. In Alcott's novel Eight Cousins, for instance, she has Aunt Jessie say regarding such rags to riches stories, quote, even if the hero is merely an honest boy trying to get his living, he is not permitted to do so in a natural way by hard work and years of patient effort, but is suddenly adopted by a millionaire whose pocketbook he has returned, or a rich uncle appears from sea, or the remarkable boy earns a few dollars, speculates, and grows rich so rapidly that Sinbad in the Diamond Valley is a pauper compared to him, end quote. Not only does the film's version of social rising seem to directly contradict Alcott's ideas, it could be asked if this film is really attempting to adapt Little Women rather than the short story. Does resolving certain tensions between the readership of Little Women and the events in the story actually disempower Tilly Bassett, Joe March, and even Alcott herself? It seems as if one could argue that short story Tilly and novel Joe's independence, hard work, and capabilities are removed if film Tilly come Joe travels around the world on someone else's money and then is simply married off to the wealthy friend next door. Considering the film An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving as an adaptation of Little Women rather than Alcott's short story leaves us with many unanswered questions about the purposes of this particular adaptation and the unintended consequences of changing the story to suit the audience's desire for happier resolutions to the life challenges which form an important role in shaping Alcott's original characters. It also leaves us a little uncertain about whether the adapters felt that Alcott's short story could not stand on its own as a humorous tale. Why, instead, did it need a drastic change from a delightful comedy of errors to domestic drama? Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you to all our panelists. I'd like to open it up. Yes, please. Thank you. let's open it up for some questions. If you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, Greg and I will keep an eye out. And if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Maybe I could open up the questions with one of my own. So I was thinking, what are your, this is for all of you, what are your thoughts on the narrative style of Gerwig's adaptation, which shifts the textual center from the linear to one that's centered on part second. If this is not the what the critic Amanda quoted, a nostalgic gesture, then what is it? Aryssa argued that it elicits a greater sympathy for Amy. Well, what else do you think the cross-cutting nonlinear style does? And does this allow for the greater intertextuality that Jaclyn and Heidi spoke of?
I can start if you'd like. I'm not sure about the intertextuality question, but the first part of that, it's in many ways it's the opposite of nostalgic, right? I mean, what it does is it centers, and this gets to Aryssa's point too, the sort of complexity of grown women, right? Where things are more difficult, there are deaths, there are economic troubles, right? And all these ways that the kind of glowing portrait of the childhood part of it, ignores or doesn't deal with yet, right? And if we center that in other adaptations, that's that kind of remains with you as a viewer. I think one of the things that a lot of reviewers noted, right, is the visual style is so different, like the coloring of the tone of visually, right, there's like a yellowish glowing portrait to the flashbacks versus a kind of bluer, grayer present day. But I think, I think that she foregrounds the complexity of heading more into a kind of realism. I think trying to pull those aspects of the novel out, away from some more nostalgia, the kinds of things that are associated, at least with the critics that I looked at, with like sentimentalism and stuff like that. So I think that's interesting.
I would agree. It feels more of a question of reflection than nostalgia. I personally felt like the narrative structure of the 2019 film was especially made for readers. It was made for people that knew the film, that didn't want to watch from Christmas Won't Be Christmas to the very end for the 400th time. We wanted something different. We wanted to be able to engage with it differently. And I do feel every time I watch the film, I will not say how many times because I have lost count, but it is many, I find something new that she has done narratively, whether it's the scene pairing, like with Amy and then the foot mold, whether it's, there's one where Amy is walking out from Beth and she says, "Don't look at me like that." And then it cuts immediately to Lori looking at Joe like that, just narratively, it just enriches it, especially for people who already know the story, which is a lot of people, but maybe not enough. But that's a discussion for your next panel.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too, as agreeing with both of you. But also, I think that I'm sort of, as a person who works with 19th century periodicals, I'm sort of primed to think about how audiences think about things. And so I've sort of learned recently, and probably none of us here have done this, but maybe we know people who did have the experience of just reading the first part, just the childhood part of Little Women. And so I think that Gerwig has in a way introduced some readers to things that they didn't know about Little Women, to things that they didn't expect, as well as having done something new and different with the story, something that we can come back to, even people who know the story well. So Yeah.
I'll jump in here with a question. This is a question for Amanda, though a couple of the other papers touched on it, and it's the issue of honesty. I always wonder about that. I mean, it's an issue for adaptation in part because folks who know the original text, right, the novel, will be concerned if it's not faithful to the original, if it's dishonest in some way. So it's an interesting issue. But what I wonder is, why are the anti-sentimentalists always coming off with the wondering whether it's true or false? And the reason I ask that is because this is my sentimentalist side. It hurts as a sentimentalist, right? Because that's a dishonest emotion has got to be the thing that pains a sentimentalist most. And so to critique something as being dishonest emotion or false emotion seems to really be really painful. And so I'm wondering what you think about, well, why is that the criticism? Is it because they know that hurts the most? Is it because it's a worry around sentimentality that people could somehow fake emotion? And if we're trading on fake emotion, that's the beginning of the end for society morally, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so often used, right, as a mark of, is the opposite of art, right? That if something is sort of plain emotion, in other words, it hasn't been dressed up or made oblique in some way, right? Or it's not rational, or, that if it's not, that one of those reviews was like a surprisingly intelligent, right? I think Roger Ebert said that. It's the opposite of all those things, right? So I think but why I think it's linked to the history of the sentimental and its association with women, right? Because the idea of the head versus the heart, women versus men, and then the kind of hierarchy of the head over the heart, right? If women are the kind of producers of the sentimental by the late 19th century and into the 20th, I think that's a way to dismiss it out of hand, right? Because you can say it's not artistic, it's not using the head, right? It's just using the heart, and that's why women's work, right, is not should not be taken seriously. So even the way we talk about, when they talk about women authors like Emily Bronte as being this, like, not necessarily around the sentimental, but this idea that she was just sort of spitting out language. It just came from the heart, and there's no crafting to it, right? Same with the way they talk about Jane Austen, even so in the 19th century. So I think there's that kind of anti-artistic, anti-reason, right, association with women's culture, and I think that hangs on. I mean, whoever the gender, in terms of who's producing it these days, I think its association with that continues. So that's why I would say it's about gender, in short.
I have a question to kind of any and all of us. It's really wonderful collection of papers. I'm really struck by the moves of a number of these recent adaptations of Little Women to cast Jo as Alcott herself. And it seems there's not much conversation in the criticism about how Alcott really is adapting her own life to Little Women in a very kind of self-conscious kind of way. And is that coming up in the reviews? Is that an admission in the reviews? Is there a sense that, it's fine for Greta Gerwig to think about Jo as Louisa May Alcott kind of in a one-to-one correspondence, but it's really not how Alcott herself went through this whole process of becoming an author. What's your sense on that? I'm thinking, I was looking briefly at some of the letters that Alcott's writing for the Commonwealth, really interesting topic, where she's also kind of revising her experience, but as herself, like she's writing as herself in that context, but also crafting herself. And then, the Tribulation Periwinkle character comes in there. That seems like a really interesting question that hasn't really been part of the conversation of film critics of the adaptation. I'd love to hear people's comments.
Yeah, I believe in what I saw that it's not talked about enough, especially in the robustness of the adaptations. But with the Gerwig adaptation in particular, based on the reception Lady Bird got, I believe a lot of them approached her choice to make Alcott Joe in the same way they approached the way Lady Bird was autobiographical, and they approached it more as a conversation she as a director and screenwriter was having with the art of film, and that being kind of an obvious choice for her to make. But I think it's a great question, especially as we explore Joe's imperfections and just in conversation with the way women are assumed to have, female authors especially are assumed to be the character who reads, in conversation with like Jane Austen, things like that as well. I think that's a conversation to keep going.
I have a question. I've done several papers on Louisa May Alcott and her films, and everybody keeps talking about the 2019 film. I'm going to age myself because I'm going to ask a question in regards to the 1933 film and the 1994 film. The 33 film, Katharine Hepburn wanted to make that movie. She made it, and it was pretty good to the story. In the 1994 film, I was a little concerned about Susan Sarandon doing a little political commentary about women wearing the corsets and how it impaired women's health, which Marmee never said per se. And then having Joe sit in an abolitionist meeting in New York with Dr. Baird, which I thought was a little strange too. That seemed a little out of context. Is that a way that they do adaptations to put current ideas into a film? Or I don't know if it really took away from the story that much, but it just seemed pronounced to me.
I feel like that's kind of similar to the speech they give Amy in the 2019 one as well, about marriage being an economic proposition. And I do think it's very much a product of the times and the people involved. A lot of the time people come to Little Women with like a deep, deep passion for the story, but also a lot of sentiment for the modern moment. So I can definitely see that bleeding through, you know, hopefully in ways that meld to the story more, like with the abolitionist thing, it may be a more autobiographical insertion, but definitely kind of related to the politics of the time, I'd say.
I would also add to that, you know, so I didn't look at reviews of the 1933, but in 1994, several of them critiqued exactly what you're talking about. Susan Sarandon's kind of feminist, you know, more modern comments about things like that. And it's interesting too, because it's not just, of course, adaptations always reflect their particular context, but the appetite for that has shifted, I think, and the sort of insertion of politics, like in the reviews of the 2019, I don't see anybody kind of questioning that speech by Amy. I mean, that's highlighted as a positive thing, right? That insertion. And I think that's quite different from 1994, where I think somebody said, maybe it was Ebert, somebody else said, Marmee is reduced to, you know, a progressive platform, I don't know, something like that, or platitudes. She says that that's what she does. So the kind of this moment we're in, where there's more appetite for kind of direct, particularly feminist, right, statement. It's just interesting how that shifts as well. So I mean, they all reflect their time period, but that's part of the conversation too.
I think it's notable too that the most recent adaptation of Alcott is the one that most directly engages, or the most recent adaptation of Little Women is the one that most directly engages with Alcott, her biography and her works too, because Gerwig brings in stuff from other Alcott works other than Little Women. I don't know if I have a great way of parsing that, but I think it's maybe something that maybe there's a more interest in women writers right now. Maybe there's more interest in Alcott right now. I think there is something maybe within the film industry or something that informs those different shifts over time.
And I would say too, I think there's a shift in, right, I mean, the kind of the publication or the revelation of Alcott's other writings, you know, that happened in the previous decades, and the kind of interest in her more, you know, complicated and more radical work too. Like that, I think that has trickled down into the popular understanding as well. So there just seems like a big shift in multiple areas of the culture.
Yeah, and if I may add this, the 1950 version it starts with that. It's like a commercial for Christmas shopping. So you know, seeing it in as a work of culture, and I think, you know, yeah, there's probably a lot of feminisms within each iteration, and definitely within the most current adaptation. Well, thank you to everyone who was part of this great discussion, and thanks again to our panelists. Usually we give a round of applause, so why don't we unmute and applaud our panelists? Thank you.